Hi everyone, I'm sorry I still look and sound the way that I do, but I'm afraid I'm still on death's door. But this is our opportunity to unpack Betty's story in the first instance. And we see that in Betty's story, there's a couple of things that are happening. And so this first mini video will focus on the issue with Carl. So just to refresh your memory, Al and Betty are second time around marriage. Each of them have children from a previous marriage. And Carl is the child of Al, so the stepson, adult stepson, if you will, of Betty. And we can see in this relationship that there are some concerns on Carl's part, and then that becomes at least a more overt resentment as we go through. But just as a quick refresh, that Betty previously had her own two biological children, Ross and Dorothy. Dorothy, we don't talk about till a little bit later. Dorothy has moved out west. And Ross is the one that's running the company predominantly. That was the family business, which was an HVAC, heating and air conditioning installation and repair business. And Betty has always done the books, but Ross is really kind of running the company as it seems. But this first one we're going to focus on is Carl. So with Betty and her husband Al, you see that they have an active lifestyle and they're traveling and they're going south and going to the cottage and so forth. And when it comes to it, Al becomes increasingly unwell from a series of strokes. And at each point, his needs increase and Betty starts taking over the caregiving duties of them. And so you see that upon each stroke, less and less are they able to travel and to do. At this point, I'll just make a note that Ross has been appointed. This is the biological son of Betty, the power of attorney to run the business, and we'll talk about that in the second video. But let's talk about Carl and the issue of the power of attorney. So over the course, we see that this is a scenario where there are two competing powers of attorney. You have Betty, who is the power of attorney for personal care. And if it was in a different jurisdiction like British Columbia, for instance, that would be a representation agreement, or the Yukon, a representation agreement, or in Nova Scotia, some form of a healthcare directive and representation agreement. But in most places, it's some type of a power of attorney for personal care. And that's the document that allows you to make personal care decisions around your health, healthcare consent issues, wellness, where you live, how you dress, and so on. And that's supposed to be the lead attorney. That's supposed to be the one who determines the care needs, and the power of attorney for property is supposed to be one who essentially writes the checks, as long as it's within reason and it's financially feasible to do so. But we see that that's not what happens here. So Betty wants to bring Carl back home. He's had, again, the last stroke, and he's in a chronic care, kind of what we would consider alternative levels of care. He's betwixt and between. But in order for him to come home, there's a series of modifications that have to be made to Betty's home. And this is kind of where we get some of that resentfulness from Carl coming up. So the doctors tell Betty and Carl that Al is now quite incapacitated, and Carl's the power of attorney for property, and Betty, his wife, is the power of attorney for personal care. But Carl does not want to spend any money making the housing modifications. He's, I think, thinking that he doesn't want to enrich Betty, and is assuredly thinking about his own financial future as somebody who's going to inherit. So he doesn't want to spend the money on embellishing Betty's house, even though it's to keep Al at home. So he says that the only thing he'll pay for is a long-term care facility. And indeed, a long-term care facility in Carl's town, which is 5 hours away from Betty. They're at an impasse, so Betty certainly doesn't want to have this happen, and Carl won't pay for something else. So that is deeply problematic. And when you see that, you'll see that some other things are happening financially. Carl starts redirecting Al's incomes from a joint account that he would have with Betty. So he's now moving money out of a joint account. And we know that if you're joint, means you both own it. But as a power of attorney, he's allowed to certainly move money out as long as he's acting in an appropriate fashion. And soon we also see that the lawyer tells her that money that she and Al had from the joint account and put into GICs were now Al's, and she has to pay them back. So we don't know what that means. It shouldn't be that case. And she discovered that, in fact, Carl has not only withdrawn the money, but he has cashed them out. So we have to be thinking about financial abuse there. You see that there it comes to a head. Betty is starting to feel particularly worried about the financial circumstances, and he tells Betty that she has sponged off Al and the family long enough, and he will not pay for anything else. Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. So Betty's the person who, as his wife, is trying to make sure that he can age in place and age home. And she, as the attorney for personal care, should be the lead attorney. So it should be that Al gets what needs to have happen, and financially speaking, that Carl would do what's both in Al's personal desires, his values, wishes, and beliefs, which in this case sounds like he probably would want to be with Betty, as opposed to what Carl wants, which is to preserve assets and obviously drive a financial wedge between them. We see Carl cashing out joint funds quite inappropriately. That should be a red flag for financial abuse. But is he legally allowed to do that? Well, it's an area of I would say some gray. It would be, I think, inappropriate for him to do that. Whether it's illegal is maybe a different question, but he's certainly not acting in the way that he should as a financial power of attorney. But what we're seeing is that Betty is getting into a very difficult situation. Right now, she doesn't have access to her own funds. Certainly, those GICs were joint. That's important money for her as she ages. And there's an expectation that half of those funds would certainly be her. If they were joint, though, really, in truth, they both own those GICs. And so it's actually Betty's money. So what we see is Carl is refusing to do what his father Al would want him to do, which is to pay for modifications, I think, to Betty's home so that he can move back. We see also that Carl is later claiming that they're separated and that they are, relationship separated as opposed to physically separated. And that's an important distinction. Relationships can be such that someone gets care provision and the other person is not eligible for that kind of care provision, and so they can be separated by being in a hospital, or the other person being at home, or being in a chronic care, or alternative levels of care, as it is in this particular case, or by any other reason. It doesn't mean that they are, in fact, separated in a family law instance. So we see here real problems with Carl, and whether or not he is acting appropriately as an attorney, I think it's pretty clear in this case that he is not acting appropriately. So what could somebody do? Well, in this particular instance, it's pretty difficult. Really, Betty could take Carl to court if she had the finances to do so. She could apply for Carl to be removed because of the way that he's acting, and ask to be a guardian of Carl. And as we saw from previous times, there is this hierarchy. She cannot, however, go to the Consent Capacity Board because the Consent Capacity Board only can make really decisions with regards to health and personal care. So there's no question that with regards, that Betty is able to be the decision maker for health and personal care. It's just the problem is trying to get somebody to pay for it. So at this point, we're going to see that Betty really should be going to a lawyer. She should be acting to preserve her own finances, and she should probably see if she can get either Carl to change his mind or may need to challenge Carl in court about his decision making. Let's end that little section on Carl, and on our next video, come back and talk about what's happening with Ross.